Greetings from Austin, Texas. My name is Ruth Wassam, and I'm a professor of public policy practice at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas. This year, the LBJ School turns 50. Throughout this landmark year, we celebrate LBJ School's half-century of impact, not just within the walls of academia, but in the arena. Thank you for joining us. The 2020 election is only a few weeks away, and some people have already started voting. This is a historic election for so many reasons. Last night was the first of 3 presidential debates, and the first time we've seen the 2 candidates face-to-face on the debate stage. Today, we've invited some of my LBJ colleagues for a roundtable discussion on what we learned from each of the candidates during last night's debates. I am especially thrilled to be joined by Bill Shute. He's the executive director of the LBJ School in Washington Center in Washington, D.C., and they are the co-sponsor of today's session. And Bill's also one of our panelists. I'm going to hand it over to Bill to introduce everyone to the LBJ Washington Center.
Well, thanks, Ruth. Really happy to be co-hosting with you today. The Washington Center is LBJ's foothold in our nation's capital. Now, our mission is to work with our faculty, external thought leaders, decision makers in the federal arena in an attempt to help bring sound research and reasoned analysis to our country's grand challenges and enhance the public discourse in these policy deliberations. Now, the cornerstone of the Washington Center is our 15-month accelerated master's degree program in which students pursuing degrees in public affairs, global policy studies, spend a traditional first year in Austin, but then immediately relocate to Washington to not only finish their degree with our faculty cohort of recognized federal experts, but they gain practical professional experience by completing a 6-month policy apprenticeship with a sponsoring organization. And if you'd like more information about the LBJ School of Public Affairs Washington Center, please visit our website at dc.lbj.utexas.edu.
Thanks, Bill. Now today, each of our panelists have been given one of the pre-announced debate topics, which were chosen by the moderator, Chris Wallace of Fox News. And they will share with us their thoughts on each of the candidates' responses and performance on these topics. Bill will be speaking today about the Trump and Biden records, alongside with Dr. James Galbraith, the Lloyd Benson Chair in Government and Business Relations and Professor of Government, who will be speaking about the economy. William M. Bowden, an Associate Professor of Policy Affairs and the Executive Director of the William Powers Jr. Chair at the Clements Center for National Security, will be speaking about COVID-19 and national security. Victoria DeFrancesca Soto, the LBJ School Associate Dean for Civic Engagement and a lecturer at the LBJ School, will be speaking about election integrity. And Dr. Peniel Joseph, the Barbara Jordan Chair in Ethics and Political Values and the founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy, will be speaking on race and violence in our cities and how these were addressed in last night's debates. Before they begin, just a little bit of housekeeping. We are going to keep all of our panelists initially to 5 minutes on their topic as they start. We know there's a lot to unpack here, but we want to make sure to get as many audience questions as we can today. And for those of you in the audience, please submit your questions for our panelists throughout the session via the Q&A button on the bottom right of your screen. The Q&A button on the bottom right of your screen. Now I'd like to kick it off with Bill Shute talking about Trump and Biden records. Bill, here are my questions for you. Did the candidates even talk about their records? If so, what did we learn about the Trump and Biden records? And what was missed opportunity for each of them to share with the American people on their policy records.
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. I think you summed it up really well by saying missed opportunity. And I gotta open by saying I'm sure glad we're doing this today, because after last night's unpresidential debate, it's hard to imagine many people are going to tune in to the next two, or maybe even pay attention to them. When we look at the records of each of the candidates, each has a fairly lengthy record in their own right, although not so much for the president. In fact, even before the 2016 election, I have to say that his record was more about his character. You either like it or you don't. But if we look at his term so far, the number of things do stand out. From Inauguration Day until this past March, his record was based on things like attempts to undo the ACA or the TCJA tax cuts, attacks on immigration, and of course his responses or lack of responses to social unrest. From March until Friday, September 18th, his record was all about the national leadership aspects of the pandemic in response to COVID-19. From Friday night, September 18th, till just about this past Sunday, it was all about filling a vacancy on the Supreme Court. And now since Sunday, we can add to that list his tax returns. For Vice President Biden, it's an entirely different story because, as we heard last night, 47 years of public service has led to a very wealthy record that his opponents can easily pick apart. Some of the highlights that I think people have been focusing on in this election season are his support of the Iraq War. That still comes up. The 1994 crime bill. He sponsored bills to slow down school integration. He voted for NAFTA. He didn't handle the Robert Bork or Clarence Thomas nomination hearings very well when he held the gavel at the Senate Judiciary. And quite frankly, reinforced a bit last night, we're not going to be able to outright dismiss the role of Hunter Biden and Ukraine. This will resonate with Trump's base. Historically, first debates have always benefited the challenger, but typically that just means that debates tend to sway the undecided. We don't have a lot of that going on right now. In fact, the latest Washington Post ABC poll from this week shows that 98% of likely voters have already made up their mind. And then, quite frankly, that leads me to think that that 2% of undecided might more aptly be described as unwilling to publicly declare at this point. Now, liberals are very concerned about so many things that might come in a Trump second term, such as a conservative Supreme Court that could undo Roe v. Wade or Obamacare, the continued socioeconomic inequality issues, and of course, racism. Where on the other side, conservatives seem to be very worried that Biden could be nothing more than a Trojan horse full of AOC-type progressives who are set on undoing the cultural and economic progress conservatives have promoted since the end of the Obama administration. One thing that's really resonating among concern of conservatives right now is that a Democratic administration and a Congress controlled by Democrats would immediately do things like raise individual, corporate, and estate taxes during an economic downturn. So here's what I'm going to be watching during the remaining days of this season. Now, since it appears that most voters have already made up their minds, so this election could come down to turnout in 3 key states and among 3 key demographic segments. The traditional battleground states of Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, which has picked every presidential winner since 1948, with the exception of JFK and Nixon in 1960. And then on the Democratic segment side, I'm looking to see what white suburban women do. Back in 2016, they represented 41% of the vote and went with Trump 47 to 45. Very divided. Very curious about the turnout of 18 to 29-year-olds, particularly those who consider themselves progressives, because historically, as we all know, this age group has not turned out heavily in presidential elections. In fact, 2016 represented only 13% of the electorate, and heavily went for Clinton, 58 to 28. And then finally, I'm very curious what Catholics as a group tend to do here. The Catholics have picked every presidential winner since 2004. In 2016, they represented 20% of the vote and went heavily for Trump, 52 to 44. When we circle back around to the Supreme Court hearing, I think this topic might just come up again. So let me just close by saying it's going to be exceptionally fascinating to see how much of this election is impacted by turnout and the perceptions of a process that has integrity.
Thanks, Bill. Up next is Dr. Jamie Galbraith talking about the economy. And there are the same questions that I asked Bill, I'm asking you, Jamie. Did the candidates even talk about the economy? If so, what did we learn from them? And what was the missed opportunities here for each of them to share with the American people about their economic records?
Well, thanks very much, Ruth. And you asked the right question because, in fact, I can be quite brief. They didn't talk about it very much, but they did talk about it a little bit. And I must say, I have never been more put in mind than last night of the famous closing words in the great work of John Maynard Keynes, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, which the final paragraph includes this sentence: "Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back." It just seemed to me to capture the spirit of last night's occasion extremely well. What I want to do, though, is to say a little bit about the context and then a little bit about what President Trump and Vice President Biden brought in terms of their underlying thinking to the situation. So if you don't mind, I can share my screen briefly with a chart that I think captures the overall situation reasonably well. It's an employment to population ratio and going back to 1950. And you can see, and it's different from national economic growth and other unemployment, but it gives you a pretty good sense of the evolution of the economy over a long period of time. And you can see that for the years up to 2000, the proportion of the American population that held jobs continued to rise with interruptions from time to time. After 2000, it started to fall, and it fell very, very sharply in the Great Recession and the aftermath of the financial crisis, 2007, 2009. In the beginning of the Obama-Biden administration, things began to improve, and they improved, and this is the point I want to make, relatively continuously through the first 3.5 years of the Trump administration. So whatever forces were bringing on a slow improvement, not returning to the peaks that had been achieved in the 1990s, but still not interrupted by another recession, were continuous between Obama and Trump. And then, of course, came March, April of 2020, and the thing fell completely apart. And we dipped to a level of employment which is below anything on the historical record since the Second World War, actually since the 1930s. So it's a remarkable collapse that occurred. And the question, and it divides the two candidates, is what's going to happen next? And it's Trump's proposition, basically, and that of his advisors, that the economy was extremely strong under his administration. You can't say anything else. And that there will be a very rapid recovery, a V-shaped recovery. And you can see that there's, at least a little bit of evidence that that's perhaps not entirely wrong, we're not where we were back in April, that this ratio has come back quite a bit. But one can, looking at the overall pattern, be very open to doubt that it's going to come back all the way or anytime soon start improving on the what had been achieved very gradually over 11 or 12 years after 2007. And so the Biden position is that the economy needs help, and that therefore one needs to have, and the term is stimulus or booster shots, and Vice President Biden last night was relying on no doubt material his advisors gave him, that said, okay, if we do this, we will create so many million more jobs over the course of the next 8 years, and we need to do this in order to create those jobs. And that's basically the difference between the two candidates. So the question is which is right and which is wrong. My own view is neither is right, that the situation is far more serious than either allows for, because it doesn't take into account the very basic structural changes in the US economy, the very great fragility of all these service jobs that were created in the last 12 years that basically can't come back until everybody else has a job. So there's a kind of chicken and egg problem, as well as the fact that some of our core industries like the aircraft industry and so forth depend upon the world market, which is fundamentally not going to come back in any reasonable time period. So I think basically by relying in Biden's case on the 2009 experience and in Trump's case on his basic feeling that the economy is simply a rubber band that will bounce back once the shock is over, both of them are misleading the public to a degree. Trump perhaps considerably more than Biden, but nevertheless, that would be my view. There's also kind of, you can think about an economic theory here that I would briefly describe as Roman letter economics. Let me kill my screen sharing here and or come up with a new share very briefly. But never mind. I will do it anyway. The Roman letter economics I would describe as the use of the alphabet to describe what's going on in the economy. We're going to have a V-shaped recovery, that's Trump's position, an L-shaped recovery in which we basically go flat and don't recover at all, a W-shaped recovery in which we have a double dip, or a K-shaped recovery, which came up last night and was new to me, I think a couple of days ago, the idea that it's going to be good for the people at the top and bad for the people at the bottom, which was also part of Biden's position. There's some merit to it because obviously the markets have recovered and jobs and employment have not. Or you can say, well, the Roman alphabet isn't rich enough, and I tend to go with the Hebrew, the Vav there, which gives, I think, a good description of my rather pessimistic view of things. And I'll just say in closing that I once managed to get this particular line into an op-ed piece for the New York Times. And I was told it was accepted. I should send in the revisions by 9 o'clock the following morning. The date was September 10th, 2001. So the op-ed never saw the light of day. But it wasn't for that reason necessarily wrong. And I think we should be wary, and we should be thinking in terms of policies that that don't assume that we're going to go back to where we were either automatically or with a boost. And we should be dealing with the situation as we see it, and using full powers of the state and our imaginations to try and figure out what it is that we need to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jamie. Next up, we have Will Imboden, and he'll be talking about COVID-19 and national security. And if you don't already know the questions, you're going to get the same ones. Did the candidates talk about COVID-19? What did we learn from them about it? And what are the missed opportunities that for each of them where they could have shared their positions on national security to combat COVID-19?
Well, thank you, Ruth. I will start with two similarities with Jamie. First, a little bit of historical perspective, and second, a lament that these issues were not covered very much last night, especially national security, a little less so on COVID. So this is certainly not shaping up to be a major foreign policy election. The stakes are very big in this election, but it's much more of an inward focused American domestic economic social policy election. When you look at voter surveys, voters ranking the issues that matter most to them, foreign and national security policy ones are nowhere near any of the top. And that's not completely abnormal. For the historical perspective, at least as I look at over the last 50 plus years, I only see 3 presidential elections where foreign and defense policy were really significant factors. It can be there in all of them, but I'd say the 1968 election, of course, where Vietnam is the big issue, not the only one, but the big one, and plays a big role, and of course in our school's namesake LBJ not running for re-election. 1980, Carter versus Reagan, where the Cold War and the Iran hostage crisis are two of the issues at the top of the list of voter concerns. And then the 2004 election, Bush v. Kerry, where war on terror, Iraq, Afghanistan were pretty high on voter concerns. So in that sense, the fact that this current election is more domestically focused is not an aberration. But what was an aberration is the fact that these issues came up hardly at all in the debate last night. That was, and as I tried to, as I suffered through watching it last night, listening keenly for where these issues come up, the 4 different times where foreign and defense policy came up even obliquely, each one happens to start with a C, and I'll come to those, but was all tied right back to domestic concerns again. The first is China. China came up briefly, but it did in the context of the COVID pandemic and Vice President Biden's criticisms that Trump was initially too credulous in listening to Xi Jinping's assurances that China had this under control. And so, Biden was in some ways attacking Trump from the harder line side if you were too soft on China. And then Trump in turn with his rejoinder that he imposed a travel ban on China relatively early, which Biden had criticized. The second is the corruption issue, and particularly the Ukraine question, when there was the pretty tawdry exchange over Hunter Biden. And that was brief and towards the end. The third is climate change, which again, of course, is a global issue. But the way it was discussed last night was primarily in terms of domestic policy. The California wildfires and the questions of whether Trump even accepts climate change as a fact and as a frontier concern. And then finally, there is COVID, the coronavirus pandemic, and that was discussed a little bit more last night, which I was glad to see because it is such a crisis for our country and our world. But again, most of the discussion on it was focused more on President Trump's, the adequacy or inadequacy of President Trump's response here domestically, whether it was on testing, on mask wearing, on empathy for the many Americans, the over 200,000 dead and the families who have suffered from that. So the fact that even when potentially international issues came up, it was in the context of domestic policy, I thought was revealing that that's where the candidates' focus is, that's where the voters' focus is, that's where the debate questioners' focus is as well. Finally, you had asked about what foreign and defense policy issues I wished would have been addressed. I think a couple big framing questions I would like to see if there is another debate, or people may not be up for one after the tawdriness of last night, would asking Vice President Biden if there are any Trump foreign policies that he would actually agree with and want to continue. I know there's plenty that he disagrees with, but would like to hear on that. And then likewise asking Trump any of his foreign policies that he would change, any foreign policy mistakes he thinks he may have made and would change, revise if there was a second term. Then more specifically, I'll just rattle off a few what I think are certainly the major concerns of national security experts right now. The Russia relationship, whether it's Russia's ongoing interference in our elections, but also their destabilization and an aggression in Ukraine, in Central and Eastern Europe. Second, of course, the really big one is China, the U.S.-China relationship, this great power competition we find ourselves in with China. How do we manage that so it doesn't turn into either a Cold War or even a hot war? And how do we address the still very extensive economic interdependence between our countries while we're also dealing with a strategic divergence? Middle East, Iran, Israel and the Abraham Accords, the campaign against ISIS and some seeds of resurgence we are seeing there. And then finally, North Korea. That was one of Trump's big signature initiatives to hold 2 summits with Kim Jong-un. They got a lot of acclaim and news, but nothing positive seems to have come from them. So I think those are all issues that certainly foreign policy experts are interested in seeing addressed in the debates.
Thanks, Will. Dr. Victoria DeFrancesca Soto is up next, and she's going to be talking about election integrity. And I can repeat the questions, but I think you've heard them enough, and I'll turn it over to Vicki.
how long have I been doing Zoom and I still forget to unmute myself? So, all right, here we go for reals this time. So in terms of election integrity, last night, I think there are two big issues, right? The first was whether the candidates agreed to accepting the election results and a peaceful transition to power. And then the second question within election integrity is the voting procedures themselves. That, you know, we're coming up on this unprecedented election, whether it's going to be mail fraud, voter fraud. So those were the two big themes I saw within that. I'm going to quickly tackle the first one because there's not a whole lot to unpack, right? So over the last week, I believe it was a week ago this Wednesday, that President Trump, in speaking to reporters, said he wasn't necessarily going to commit to a peaceful transfer of power if there was still questions about, you know, who won the election. So that's been in the news for the past 7 days. You know, is Trump going to commit to accepting election results or not? That came up last night, and we saw the same type of response that President Trump gave a week ago and has been reiterating. Vice President Biden stuck to the similar line that we'd seen, that, you know, if after all of the votes are counted and they've been counted fairly, that he will accept whatever the result is. So what we saw last night was just a replay of the public discourse that we've been seeing over the past week. So I'm going to put that one aside. The second issue is about the voting process itself. And what I want to do is I want to take a couple of steps back and frame it in terms of the 2016 election. So in the 2016 election, we know that there was interference from Russia, from a foreign power, right? So that's been hanging over our head, regardless of the pandemic, regardless of the changes of how elections are run during these exceptional times. So there's that piece. So we've got Russia, and then, you know, let's throw China into the mix. And what we have in terms of where both candidates stand, we have President Trump saying, well, you know, because of the pandemic, some folks want to do more mail-in voting, but I'm very concerned about the potential for fraud. So that's President Trump's concern. And then on the other hand, you have Vice President Biden saying, we are conducting a presidential election during a pandemic. We need to focus on public health. While it's safe for some folks to vote in person, we need to be conscious of extending vote by mail, absentee ballots for folks who do not feel safe going out to vote. So those are kind of the two lines. They're kind of parallel. They're not necessarily speaking to each other. Those are the arguments that we heard again last night. But in terms of kind of what the facts are, what the numbers are, what we've been seeing over the past couple of months, the first thing is that when it comes to vote by mail, while we have some states who have done vote by mail for a long time, especially our Western states, so Oregon, Colorado, they've been doing this, they're good at it, they've got it down. But for most of the states, it's more of an exception. It's not a normal thing to do. So in the last couple of months, many states have rushed to implement vote by mail procedures. And like anything, you know, any policy, when it's rushed, the logistics get complicated, and this is where the cause for concern comes in. And I think this is where, just in general, where my concern is as someone who follows voting, who follows civic engagement, cares deeply about this on a personal and professional level. So the logistics of it. Voting by mail, I've never voted by mail. My folks vote by mail. But voting by mail, we know, if you've never done it before, can be tricky. You have to vote, you have to sign in a number of different places. You need to make sure you have the right envelopes. Different states have different criteria for voting by mail. So it can be cumbersome. And I'm not just talking about for new voters. It can be cumbersome for more sophisticated voters, but who have always voted in person. And there was a really interesting study that came out recently looking at vote by mail in the 2018 midterm election. It was looking at voting in Florida and in Georgia. And it found that the ballots that were most likely to be thrown out because they didn't comply with all those criteria of voting, of signing in this place and using the right envelope and doing who knows what, disproportionately affected young voters and minority voters. So this is really problematic in terms of how we're enfranchising low propensity voters, young voters. In terms of the fraud concern, right? So there's the logistics concern, and then there's the fraud concern that President Trump brought up last night. We really haven't seen much. There has been evidence of, some ballots being thrown out, but if you stand back and you look at the entirety of our voting system, it's pretty minor, and it's more of the exception that concerns the rule. So in terms of kind of where I stand on this, my concern, what keeps me up at night is the logistics of voting. And I had a couple of more stats here I wanted to throw at you guys. Okay, this one too, adding to my worry, like I don't have enough to worry about. In the 2020 primaries, more than 500,000 mail and absentee ballots were thrown out because of the reasons I've cited before. So this is going to be cause for concern because we know that a lot of states have extended vote by mail, even in Texas, where Texas took a more conservative stand that said, we're not going to extend vote by mail uniformly, but if folks have a comorbidity related to COVID-19, then they can opt to do mail-in voting. So in a sense, it was extended a bit. So there was that. Ruth, you asked, well, what would you have liked the candidates to speak to with respect to this issue? I don't really have an answer, but I'm going to get on my soapbox and talk about how I just wish that our patchwork voting system were more uniform. Every state just, has different regulations, different criteria, and that just allows more room for error. And then, I'll defer to my colleague, Will Imboden, on national security, but also in terms of those concerns, in terms of cybersecurity, of Russia, of China, and who knows who else trying to get involved in our elections. I just wish that we had a more integral voting system where we had a more secure view of that the votes are going to be counted. So I will leave it there. I have some other things I'll throw in, but we can get to it in the Q&A. Thanks, Ruth.
Thanks, Vicki. And now we'll, to wrap up this stellar panel of LBJ experts, we turn to Dr. Peniel Joseph, who will be talking about race and violence in American cities. And I think you'll have some things to say about last night's debate, Peniel.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth. I've got my little timer on for 5 minutes. I think last night, the lead for the debate for all of us is that the President of the United States had an opportunity to publicly denounce white supremacists and instead told them to stand by and wait to see if the election outcome is to his liking and to their liking. I think it's a mistake to talk about race and violence in cities. I think that both of the candidates left some opportunities on the floor. This year of racial and political and moral reckoning is really more about racial justice and ending systemic racism and defeating white supremacy, not just in American cities, but just in our democracy. And I think that the president had an opportunity to say publicly that he has been misunderstood, that he is not a supporter of white supremacy, that he's not a supporter of racial division. He didn't do that. But I also think we saw missed opportunities with Vice President Biden. I think what you're seeing is a Democratic Party, at least one wing of it that has been successful in this primary process, that doesn't quite have the language of anti-racism and the language to really call out this president on his long history of racial division and race baiting. That's not just about dog whistles at this point, but that's open and blunt and crass, whether saying that Mexican immigrants were rapists, whether it's Islamophobia, calling Haiti and third world countries shithole countries. These are all very, very well documented. I think that the president tried to score points by saying that Joe Biden had called African Americans super predators. And in this, that 47-year policy history that Biden's connected to, and the crime bill under the Clinton administration, the first term Clinton crime bill, which really impacts mass incarceration, is very, very important here. I thought that there's a point where the president said that no law enforcement groups have backed Biden. And he said that Biden and the far left refused to say law and order. It's important for us to understand that law and order is another racially coded dog whistle from 1968 that not just Richard Nixon, but other GOP politicians, whether you're talking about Ronald Reagan, have used. Unfortunately, Democrats came in on the side of law and order in the 1980s and 90s during the drug war and are really implicated in this too. There's a point where Biden, and I don't think people heard him, said, well, he is for law and order, but with justice. I thought he should have talked about reimagining public safety. I thought he should have said that the very fact that we have that much law enforcement that have supported a president who is interested in such racial division really speaks to the fundamental changes we need in the criminal justice system and law enforcement. I thought the president used the word suburbs as another code to say that if Biden is elected, your suburbs will be overrun. This was inherently racist because the suburbs are not all lily white. There are Latinx people in suburbs. There are Black people in suburbs. There are people, suburbs are multicultural, multiracial. Doesn't mean there's no racial segregation at times in suburbs, but it also speaks to this idea of the president telling the American people in an overt way that he's the protector and the defender of a conception of white nationalism and white civic nationalism that will defend them from all these people of color, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I thought that Biden had a real opportunity to say that this year's Black Lives Matter protests have not been about violence. We see 93% of these demonstrations have not resulted in any violence. And we've also seen that some protesters have been violent, but there's also been violence on the part of law enforcement. So when we think about race, I think race really shapes this race. I thought that neither candidate had the proper language to talk about unifying us in this moment. And the language that Biden, I thought, should have used was the language of racial justice and democracy. The language I thought the president should have used is the language of race as part of racial justice as part of a national consensus that we really had seen from every single president, at least from John Kennedy all the way up until Barack Obama. There was a new consensus that racial justice was part of the American creed, part of our national character. And I'll stop there. Oh, you're muted, Ruth.
Oh, sorry, it was bound to happen. I also want to ask, since one of the questions we weren't aware of in advance when we sent out our planning script that came up last night was about the Supreme Court. So if any of you want to make some comments about the topic that came up last night on the Supreme Court selection, this is I would love to hear from you.
Hey, Ruth, I'll jump in because I very much agreed with President Trump, who at the outset said, elections have consequences. And, you know, that is one truism that I've always believed in. Elections have consequences, hence the importance of voting, hence the importance of exercising one's voice. So, you know, I am not a legal scholar, but I do firmly agree with the fact, you know, depending on where you are on the political spectrum, you may be very happy or you may be frustrated, but for those who are frustrated, I think at the end of the day, you know, the elections have the consequences, that the Republicans have the Senate, they have the votes. It just so happened that President Trump was in the White House when these vacancies came open, and that's what political life is, and that's why elections have consequences. So that's my 2 cents on the Supreme Court, a very non-legal or constitutional analysis.
Vicki, I agree with you, but what I would say is that one of the reasons why President Obama left about 189 federal judicial seats open was because of a lack of bipartisan cooperation that every other president before Barack Obama had actually received, including Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan worked with Tip O'Neill. Tip O'Neill was the Democratic House of Representatives majority leader, and Ronald Reagan worked with Democrats in the Senate. So what we're seeing is that President Trump has benefited from the increasing end of norms within the Congress and the relationship between the chief executive of whatever party and the Congress. So we have to, so Trump at one point said he's going to put in 300 federal judges, and sort of spoke to the fact that maybe the Obama administration had been asleep at the wheel, but it's not true. They were denied the normal prerogatives that other administrations have been given up until that point. I do agree with you that the very fact that in each midterm election that President Obama faced, there was a diminution of popularity. 2010, 2014, there would have been no controversy about Antonin Scalia and Merrick Garland if the Democratic Party had held the Senate in 2014, right? So I completely agree. But we have to remember that even then, when Merrick Garland was trying to get a hearing before the Senate, what Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell said was, let the people decide. We are in the exact same situation that we were 4 years ago. And what they've decided is that power trumps ethics and trumps the integrity of our Supreme Court judicial process. So we have to hold them accountable. I thought that Biden missed an opportunity there. It's not just about Judge Amy Barrett and reproductive rights, as important as that is. It's really about the integrity of our democratic institutions. And all of us know this. I mean, Jamie, Will, Bill, Vicki, the democratic process is so important, right? So we have these demonstrations, we have these marches, but it's the process. We're all interested in the integrity of the process, right? Irrespective of what major party is in there. There's supposed to be normalization and integrity of the process. And what we're seeing is that we've lost the integrity of the process. So our institutions are failing right before our very eyes. We're used to seeing this from the outside, not the inside looking out, but we're used to seeing this in other countries. So we look at Central America, South America, Africa, Europe, and we said, look, their processes lack integrity. And we come and we try to teach them the integrity of the process. And now our vaunted democracy, we're seeing our institutions weakened and the processes failing. And that includes people saying they want to end the filibuster or pack the Supreme Court. What's going on right now is a democratic failure of longstanding institutions. The president didn't cause it, but he's exploiting the weaknesses of our institutions.
Jamie?
Neil, that's a great point that you raised, because setting ideology and partisanship aside, I am really watching this nomination process from a process standpoint and the impact that it will have in an immediate level with the election, but also longer term in how our three branches cooperate and work with each other going forward. I mean, this process is really, this nomination is really putting Senate Democrats in a bit of a bind. They have to stand up for the integrity of the process. They have the Garland example to pull back on in that regard. But here is an ultra-conservative, highly educated, highly accomplished woman who happens to be very religious, very Catholic, wears on the sleeve, proud to talk about how it influences her thought process. And yet, when she was up for her last nomination and confirmation, Senators Feinstein and Durbin raised this and challenged her on how her religious beliefs influence her thought process. They're going to have to keep that in mind and be very cognizant at the same time. They were talking about highly educated, highly accomplished woman who also just happens to be with a biracial family of 7 children at her side. So this is going to be a delicate conversation they have to have.
Jamie?
I'll just add to that without speaking to the merits of this particular nominee. This is a political battle over the future of the country. It is within the power of the Senate Democrats and the House Democrats as well, with certain things they could do, to delay the vote on the confirmation until after the election if they choose to use procedural tactics that are available to them. The real question is whether they want politically to take that responsibility and have that fight or not. But it's certainly as a political matter open to them to do so if they choose so, and it should be viewed essentially as a political struggle, and not per se as a question of whether this nominee or some other nominee would be more acceptable.
Thank you. I think it's time now to turn to some of the questions from our listeners. And so I'm going to take a look at the Q&A, and the first question that is here is something we chatted about before we went live, and that whether the moderator should have a mic silencing switch, and whether this is possible or not. And
yes.
In fact, just as we were sitting here, the Commission on Presidential Debates has announced that they intend to restructure that process.
Good to hear.
Any restructuring has to be met with approval by both Democrats and Republicans, and it's unlikely that Trump will agree to have his mic switched off. So I think it's a moot question.
Interesting. Yeah. One of our attendees has asked, as a group of policy practitioners and people who are teaching tomorrow's public servants, what do you think the debate shows the U.S. citizens, the world, and potential public servants about where we are as a nation?
I can answer that. I asked a foreign national last night her view. It happens to be the one I'm married to, and it came back in 3 words: America is doomed. This was an event which shows to the world that the democracy that we once claimed to have has sunk to a very low level and is not functioning in a way that any of us can be proud of. I think that's plain for everybody.
Ruth, if I can chime in briefly on that as well, and echo some of Jamie's discouragement. When the United States is really powerful and functioning relatively well, it still can generate resentment and frustration in the rest of the world. But I think we're seeing and hearing that the only thing that upsets the rest of the world more than a powerful, well-functioning, hegemonic United States is a broken, dysfunctional, divided United States. And so it's a sad face, I think, that we are presenting to the rest of the world. I was talking with my class earlier today about the debate last night, and we were reflecting, this is not a partisan comment at all, but thinking about the 2008 and 2012 elections, which were also pretty divisive, some big issues being debated, you know, McCain versus Obama in 2008, and then Romney versus Obama in 2012. But looking back, I think we saw that those were honorable, decent candidates who loved their country, may have had somewhat different visions for it, but wanted to do right by it, who honored the process, who honored the system. And that was a better face for us to present to the world. And so I would hope that in future election cycles, we can at least present, echoing Peniel here very much, the integrity of the process, because an honorable process with integrity becomes an important principle in its own right. It's more than just process. The process can become the principle.
Thank you for those answers. And there's a question in the chat that follows up on this in terms of talking about the integrity of the democratic process. And the question is, what guardrails would you put on our democracy so that it stays protected regardless of who's driving?
Yeah, I think you need a lot. And I think one of them would be passing a John Lewis Voting Rights Act that gives everybody the free and unfettered right to vote, that registers all 18-year-olds to automatically vote, and really end the penalization, including here in Texas, of 5 years in jail for people who accidentally vote and mistakenly vote. So we have to actually incentivize people to vote. We have to stop punishing people for trying to vote. We have to stop the active voter disfranchisement, voter suppression, including in a state like Texas, of the closing of the polls and voter ID. So there's a lot of things that we can do to provide a national voting holiday where we provide childcare and adult care for folks, and that we invest. You know, when we think about deficit spending and investing, which I support, invest in our election processes, like all of us who are interested in the process, so that the process can be unassailable, so we can have federal registrars there where people can feel free not only to observe, but not be able to intimidate anybody in terms of voting. There's a lot more that we can do, and we need the Congress to be behind this. We need a president who can be behind this really as soon as possible.
I would add to that. I've long been in favor of a universal vote by mail system. I think that we are heading now toward a real problem with a hybrid system in which a result may be announced on the election night, which will be reversed if and when the mail ballots are counted. This is not a good thing. With a universal system, you wait and you get the result once and for all, and it's definitive. That works well in Oregon. It's working well in other states that have adopted it. It is the coming thing. The sooner we move to it, the better. In contrast to what Victoria said earlier, though, I'm not in favor of a fully federalized system. I think it should remain under the control of the states. And the reason for that is that it is more secure that way. It is harder to hack a system which is decentralized and controlled by multiple authorities than it is to hack one which is under national control. So I would be very wary about turning these elections into a fully federally administered operation. But of course, as Pernilla says, you need the federal government to assure that the process is fair and accessible to everybody.
So Ruth, building on both Pernilla and James, who gave us a macro view, right? So what needs to be done in terms of ensuring rights and also the logistics of voting. I'm going to zoom in into the right here and the right now. And, you know, we need to understand what the procedures are. I know that in these days of Zoom, I'm talking to folks in Texas, outside of Texas, in Travis County, beyond. So my call is that folks, even if you're a super voter, you voted in every election, it's important that you look at the information on your county clerk's website, wherever you are. Make sure you understand it. If you're going to be voting by mail for the first time, don't say, oh, well, I know how to vote. You know, I can wing it. Do not wing it. Be informed, and also help other folks who may not have the experience in voting to get up to speed. There are so many great resources. Over the course of the summer, the Office of Civic Engagement here during the In the Arena series has had sessions where we're talking to folks from the Brennan Center. We're talking to the Travis County Clerk, the Harris County Clerk, about understanding how to vote, where you can drop off your ballot, how you can request your ballot. So my call, in addition to the macro changes, is to be informed. To don't assume, you know, maybe you know it and it's just going to be a review. That doesn't matter. Take the time to review and pull in folks who also need the help to better understand our system, because quite frankly, it is quite complicated, and especially this year.
I'm going to try to fold together two questions for our last question, and it builds on some of this. The first part of the question is more directed at our assessment of Chris Wallace. And in that, it is asking the president whether he would support a peaceful transition of power or something similar. Is that tantamount to implying that he has the option to break the law? And it's a pretty interesting question. And then the follow-up question to that and to your discussions is that the Roberts Court has shown a willingness to rule against voting policies to ensure free and fair access to the ballot box. How can voting policies be opened up as they should be, free and fair, when the court may be even more opposed to this in the future? So the juxtaposition of Wallace's question and the court.
Very, very quickly, I don't think the question invites it. I think that the president's statements had invited that. So I don't blame the moderator, who obviously was overwhelmed and at times out of his depth yesterday. So I don't blame the moderator there. I think the president's statements is what precipitated that question. The other is, I think one of the things we're seeing when we say that our democracy is imperiled, we have to rethink all these institutions. We have to rethink the Supreme Court. We have to rethink the Congress. We have to rethink the executive. So I think that right now, the positive, the hopeful perspective on this time is that this is a chance to begin again, and a chance to reimagine what we think about in terms of American democracy. And so from that perspective, even if the court as it exists now is going to be anti-voting rights, as you try to reimagine and have this expansive, fulsome democracy, you're going to have different sections and corners of society that will all be together in a way that may be able to withstand a court that doesn't want to protect people's voting rights.
Would anyone else like to comment? We are exactly at 1 o'clock.
I think that was an excellent final word.
Go ahead, Jay. Well, I'll just say very briefly that I agree with Peniel exactly in not faulting Wallace to ask that question, because as a student of our constitutional process, the thought never would have occurred to me that a president could have the option. But it is the president's words that drove that question, and it would have been a huge missed opportunity if Wallace had not asked it, much like he did on the racial violence question.
Jamie?
No, I have nothing to add to what Peniel said.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you for joining us. Please remember this video session will be up on the LBJ School in the Arena website and on the LBJ School YouTube channel by Friday. Also, please join us next Monday, October 5th at 7 p.m. for the first of our LBJ School 50th anniversary forums. Guests for these forums include Stacey Abrams, Ravaz Shaul, Darren Walker, Melinda Gates, Admiral William McCraven, Pete Buttigieg, and more. And you can see the full lineup and RSVP for these events at the forums at lbj50.org. And we look forward to seeing you again next Wednesday for another LBJ in the Arena. Thank you very much.
Thank you.